Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabester here. This is the Normal and Heroic raid guide for Imperator Margok, the final boss in Highmaul. And this is an appropriately difficult in-boss in the zone. It's a very lengthy encounter, so it's going to test your raid's ability to maintain focus and concentration throughout a very long encounter. So with that, let's get started. So before we get into explaining anything that's happening, the important concept in this fight is to understand that as the fight progresses and the boss transfers through various phases, the core abilities that he uses will be altered in one way or the other. And so the important thing is to first get a good grasp on what those core abilities do baseline, and then you can start to consider how they're modified in each of the individual phases. So the first of the four core abilities we'll talk about is Force Nova. This is a wave of energy that emanates from Margok himself and goes outward to cover the entire room. And as you pass through it, you will take damage very frequently. So the best course of action to deal with this ability in all forms pretty much is to push through it right away rather than try to outrun it or anything like that. If you have teleports or leaps that can go over it, that will avoid the damage, but otherwise simply running straight through it is going to be your best course of action. And as mentioned, all these core abilities will be modified in some way based on their base abilities, which is what we're describing here. So there you saw the wave shoot out for a moment. The next core ability is Arcane Aberration. These are just large adds that will spawn one at a time, and they need to be picked up by one of the tanks and tank near the boss so that cleave damage can benefit your total DPS to the adds. Dealing with these is somewhat up to your raid strategy, whether you want to focus on them or instead just like cleave damage, kill them off. The important thing to note though is that Arcane Aberrations do pulsing area of effect arcane damage while they're active. So if you have heavy healing, you can allow cleave damage to take care of them. But if you don't have very much healing, you may want to focus on them as soon as they're available. The third ability is Mark of Chaos, and this core ability is cast on the current main tank of the boss, and it causes an 8-second debuff. When that debuff expires, the tank will explode, dealing massive damage to anyone within 35 yards. So, the basic idea, generally speaking, is for the tank to move away from the raid, all raid members at least 40 yards or so, and explode safely within that 8-second window. The fourth ability is Destructive Resonance, or also known as Mines. And this simply targets a random ranged raid member and drops a mine under their location. These are just circular, bombs basically that activate after a couple seconds once they're cast, and any player that steps in one receives significant damage, does damage to the raid, and the player that stepped in it also will be debuffed for 45 seconds, basically causing them to be stunned for a short period anytime they take arcane damage, which is all very frequently on this fight. So exploding mines is pretty bad news. And handling these generally is going to be done by stacking up the raid in various ways. And again, we'll talk about that specific method as we go through the phases. The final core ability is Arcane Wrath, or Branded. And this is by far the most iconic ability for the encounter, but also most complicated, which is why I saved it for last. The boss will cast Arcane Wrath on a random raid member. It can target anybody except tanks. And when it's complete, it will apply the Branded debuff. So generally I refer to this ability as Branded. The Branded debuff lasts for 4 seconds. And when it expires, it will deal moderate damage to that player. But it will also then jump within a certain maximum distance to the nearest player target and increase the stack size. Then after 4 seconds on that second player, it will do increased damage because of the stack size, but also it will reduce the maximum jump distance that it can travel to the next nearest player. So you can see the table on the left there shows the baseline values for just the core version of this ability. So the first stack, it does 74,000 or so, jumps 200 yards maximum distance, but then it's halved every time after in the core ability version. So it goes down to 100 and then 50 and then 25 and so on. But meanwhile, the damage increases every jump too. So management of branded is essentially revolving around bouncing it between a select few individuals until the stack size and therefore max jump distance is low enough that on the next jump you can travel within that 4-second period far enough away from the rest of the raid to ensure that you're outside of the max jump distance range. And this will cause the last hit to do damage to that last player, but it will not jump since it cannot reach anyone else. So here you can see me at 5 stacks, I'm running far enough away that it won't jump to my partner that's helping with it. So that's the basic idea of branded. And again, this is just all the core abilities. We'll talk about the specifics and how they're altered when we go through the phases. So phase 1 in this fight, of course, lasts from the start of the fight until the boss, in this case, reaches 90% health. During this period, this is where you'll see all of the core abilities, the 5 core abilities we just discussed, in their baseline form. So this is where you can kind of get used to how they work. And then the pattern to these abilities is also vital, so you'll get used to how frequently certain things happen, in what order, and all that good stuff. Generally speaking, the frequency is Mines are number 1 by far, Arcane Wrath is number 2, Mark of Chaos and Force Nova are about equal at number 3 or 4, and Arcane Aberration is the least common at the last. So you can see that the basic positioning that we start the fight in is pulling the boss to the center of the room, and then we have all of our ranged DPS and healers stacked up off to one side, in this case off to the right of the throne. And the reason for this positioning is just kind of what we started with. You could start on the left side of the throne. That would work too. But the important thing is that when you rotate, you're rotating toward the entrance of the room. The reason that we start in that position is so that we can then move as a group when a mine is placed out on somebody. Since it will target a random ranged person, we know it's going to hit the group. So the entire group as a whole moves, left a few yards in this case, waits there until the next mine comes out and moves again, and so on. It seems kind of cumbersome at first when you do it this way, but the major advantage that we learned is that if you're just trying to spread out and you just have mines, randomly hitting people that are spread so that only 1 or maybe 2 people have to move when a mine comes out, the real issue is that it doesn't allow you to properly deal with other abilities very well, particularly Mark of Chaos, since the tanks need to be at least 35 yards away from everybody, and also Arcane Wrath becomes a lot more difficult to handle. Whereas if you're stacked up, you can invariably handle Arcane Wrath branded simply by moving those players that need to deal with it away from the stacked group. And since everybody's pretty much in one location, you know that the distance you have to go at any given moment is, however far away. So for phase 1, as well as subsequent phase 2, which happens at 90%, this is kind of the strategy that we're going to use. So I'll loop back here, and then we'll talk through some of the other methods that we're doing. So the other reason that we're taking in the center is that this allows enough space for the tanks to escape when they get Mark of Chaos. So as I discussed already, having the range group clumped up helps a lot with Mark of Chaos. But in the case of having the melee get out of range, you need to make sure that your tanks can have a free escape path. So in this case, in the first phase, when they have baseline Mark of Chaos, they simply run the opposite direction of where the ranged are. And as long as they get 35 yards out, the melee will not be affected either. Force Nova, there's nothing special going on here. You just run through it, as I mentioned at the beginning, and just heal up the damage or mitigate the damage as best you can. Force Nova does an incredible amount of damage if you run with it at all, so just going straight through it is the best course of action by far. So now let's talk about Arcane Wrath management itself, because throughout the fight, the general way you'll handle this is always the same, with a few tweaks based on the alterations for phases. So you will get Arcane Wrath or Branded right away, almost immediately when the fight starts. So you immediately have to start, practicing your methods. So the best way we found to do it is to basically have a branded buddy system. That's what I call it because I like stupid names. So 2 individuals are the branded buddies, and those 2 people are always in charge of handling it throughout the entirety of the fight, basically. So the way it works is obviously branded initially is targeted on a random raid member. Could be melee or ranged, doesn't matter. So with these stacked positions that we're using for both phase 1 and 2, we have that branded individual run backwards. So basically behind us, in the case of ranged, or in the case of melee, toward the ranged, about halfway to the range in that case. And then they are automatically further away than the other clump of players. From there, you then stay stationary until the 4-second branded expires, and meanwhile the 2 branded buddies, in this case myself and one of our warlocks are the branded buddies, they will stack up on top of that player that was initially afflicted and wait for branded to jump to one of those 2 people. Once it jumps off the original target immediately goes back to their assigned position, either ranged or melee, whatever it is. But the 2 branded buddies remain out of position slightly. And in fact, they try to slowly leapfrog one another, always remaining closest to each other so that it doesn't jump to somebody else that might be closer, until the stack count is high enough that they can then boot it out of there and escape. So because of the high movement abilities of monks, I'm the sort of the buddy that's in charge of resetting it. So you can see me doing that frequently throughout the video here. But that's the basic idea. So there you can see it's on my warlock buddy, and then it jumps to me, and now it's at 6 stacks, and that is plenty in this particular phase with the alterations that it has for it to reset. So he can move back into normal position. So just assign 2 people. I think 2 is plenty. 3 seems overkill. It's just taking one other person out of the system when you don't need to do so. But you should also have a backup player ready. So in case one of your branded buddies dies and you want to continue with your attempt, of course, you should have someone ready to take over that person's position in the system. But like I said, the best thing you can do is practice that. Get 2 people that can handle it very well. Probably the most difficult thing when you're getting used to handling that is simply locating the player that's afflicted by it. And I've tried a variety of methods to sort of help automate that with add-ons and stuff. Hopefully I'll have something in the near future that can assist others with it, but unfortunately not in time for this video. But the best thing you can do is, watch very closely to who is afflicted by it. Most of the boss mods will mark the player in some way, but it's still difficult to see. And otherwise they just kind of glow purpley. So there you can see it was a melee player. So I rolled forward, as did our warlock. He ran forward. We picked it up off the first jump. Then we're both backing up together. So we basically, in our case, since we're using a ranged DPS, which is the proper way to do it, we basically stay out away from the group at max range, bouncing it back and forth until it gets on me, who's in charge of rolling it out, taking it out to reset, until it gets to a high enough stack that I can confidently get far enough away. And then I roll far away, let it reset, and then I make my way back. Now, there's certainly arguments to be made to not using a healer for this, because it drastically reduces the healing output of that player. Luckily, Mistweavers are fairly well suited to that kind of position, however, since I can sort of preemptively hot a bunch of people and then run away, come back, and then heal them all up while the hots are still going, that kind of thing. But you're certainly welcome to use non-healers in this. You can use 2 ranged DPS instead. The reason that we went with healer is just because I didn't want to potentially lose the player that ran out, since you would otherwise need another healer to be in range of that person, and that could cause jumps to occur. So just by having a healer actually do it, that player can then heal him or herself when needed. So that's the reason that we're doing it, and it seems to work pretty well. All right, so let's finally start talking about how the different phases affect the core abilities. So phase 2 begins at around 85% health. The boss will teleport to the first rune that he sort of wants to charge up and get power from. And this will give him the displacement modifier. So now all the core abilities are displacement versions, which kind of sort of alter movement in a way for most of them. That's the idea anyway. So, for example, well, let's see what's the next one that's going to happen. So Mark of Chaos there, you see in the top left, that's our monk tank. He's rolling away really quickly. So Mark of Chaos causes the tank to be teleported when it's initially applied to a random location around the room. And then they still have the 8-second period in which to get away. So that's another reason, as I discussed at the beginning, why we found the clumping method for our range in particular to work really well, is because of this phase 2 Mark of Chaos version. When everyone's spread out over a much larger area and the tank gets teleported to a random location, it's very, very difficult for them to get 35 yards away if that random location is right in the middle of the clump or something. So by staying as tightly packed as possible, it makes it easier for the tanks. That said, your tanks just need to be really quick on the ball and recognize when they get teleported to a bad location, and not be afraid to communicate vocally in voice chat or whatever, watch out, I'm near whatever location or whatever. I'm going to say whatever a lot. The other major caveat with Mark of Chaos for displacement version is that if they get teleported somewhere that's not near the majority of the group, it might be near the player that is trying to get rid of the branded debuff, part of your branded buddy team. And if that's the case, that player should have a cooldown ready to go that can allow them to survive. So as a monk, I have those cooldowns available to myself if I need to eat one of the Mark of Chaos explosions, essentially. You'll also notice the branded now actually causes a fire ring around the targeted player that only that player can see, by the way. This ring essentially limits you in the space that you can move. So you can only move a few yards when you are afflicted by it. And if you try to move beyond the edge of the ring, it will just automatically teleport you back to the center. So that's a very, very common mistake, something you should drill into the heads of everyone in the raid. During this phase, if they get branded, try not to react so quickly that they just move into the edge and get teleported back to the center. Because very frequently what would happen is somebody would react too quickly as, the branded buddies are trying to get close to that player. They would then get teleported back to the middle of the pack just as they're about to lose the buff, and then it would just pass to some other random person. Then that random person, the second one, would have to then move out to actually get it onto the team that's supposed to handle it. So, like I said, the best thing you can do is just to move slowly. You want to react right away so you realize it's there, but try not to go so fast that you get teleported back. As for the branded team itself, to handle it during this phase, the easiest thing to do is just to do a leapfrog, since you can only move a short distance. Once you pick it up off the original target, one of the two partners should then just move, 4 or 5, maybe 6 yards at most, but always making sure that you're closer to the partner than anyone else, and then you can slowly move it away from the group. And so once again, I'll just throw up the distance table there for the baseline branded. It also applies to this version of branded because the distances aren't modified in the displacement version. So because you can only move that short distance every time it jumps, especially if it comes off melee, which you see it's happening here. You need to do your best to try to get the stack count high enough by the time you're out far enough that you're confident it won't jump. So the thing to remember is that the second partner in the branded buddy team can freely move when they do not have branded on them. They're not limited to that range, of course. So once you're up to enough stack count on the upcoming target, the person that's getting branded, you can then safely call, okay, other branded buddy that's not getting inflicted can move back into position far enough away, and that will prevent the jump. So again, generally it's better to have one person in the team assigned to kind of knowing when it's safe, when you're going to have enough distance, and calling out for that. So that's typically what I will do in this phase. If we get to 5 stacks on me, I know that's plenty of distance since we've been moving away slightly, and so we can have the other person move back in and it'll drop. The mines for the second phase are also modified, but only slightly. Essentially, they spawn in the same way and do the same damage and all that good stuff, except over time they will grow to about twice their size. So it just means you have to move a little bit further when you're trying to avoid an existing one, so it doesn't accidentally grow in and touch somebody. And then lastly, the force, which you see right there, this actually causes a pushback against players that are in the affliction range of it, the ring around the outside that actually deals damage while you're in it. So once you move past that ring, then it won't push you any longer, and you also won't take damage. So just like before, best course of action, run through it, just straight path. And again, if you can use movement boosts or teleports or anything like that, that'll help a lot. Once the boss reaches 55%, the first intermission phase will begin. And you're almost halfway through the fight. It's crazy long. Anyway, this intermission lasts 60 seconds, just like the second one. And you'll get a lot of adds, but you cannot attack the boss during this. He's immune. So the best thing to do is, if you notice there are some raid markers around the room, the 2 critical ones in this case are the red and the yellow. Those are on the pillars of either side of the entrance where you come into the room. And they indicate the locations that the 2 mages spawn during this intermission phase. So the mages themselves, they are just going to stand stationary, and they will chain cast an attack on a random range member. Basically, they fixate on someone for 20 seconds at a time, and they will just chain cast on that player. The bolts that they do deal moderate damage to that player, but they also have an area of effect attack. So it's important that the players that are fixated by the mages are not standing near anyone else. Because it can target melee as well as ranged, we found it best to have the melee players that are targeted move to a different target than the rest of the group is on for that period. So for example, if the group is attacking the first mage, they don't want to be stacked with the other melee that are there. So that melee player will then go attack the other mage, so they can be by themselves, essentially. And if it's on the second mage that we're attacking, then they go attack the little anomaly ads instead. Anyway, DPS priority is to kill the mages first and foremost. And if you have a Death Knight, it will help out a lot in the second intermission phase, even though we're using the technique here just for practice. But essentially, we death grip the leftmost mage facing outward, so the one at the red marker, kind of toward the center of the room, to provide a gap between the entrance of the room and where that mage spawned. And we'll talk about why in a moment. The other critical thing is that the mages cannot be stacked near themselves or other targets such as the anomalies, because if they're within about 25 yards, they will provide an aura, which is just a pretty big damage boost that you don't need. So you want to try to keep all the individual target types away from one another. Mages away from each other until they're dead, and then the anomalies away from all that stuff as well. Once both mages have been killed, then you can start killing the anomalies, but you need to be careful. The anomalies will explode and hit the entire raid for moderate damage when they die. So be careful not to AE them all down simultaneously. Instead, take your time and whittle them down one at a time or two at a time, that kind of thing. The other critical part is you don't have to go super fast, even if the boss activates again and you still have anomalies active. You can just obviously have the tank that does not have the anomalies on him or herself pick up the boss, and you have a little bit of time before Mark of Chaos starts to apply and requires tank swaps. So don't kill yourself by killing the anomalies all at once. And you can use raid cooldowns to help mitigate it, but I generally think that the raid cooldowns are better served in later parts of the fight, particularly phase 3 and perhaps even the next intermission phase. So once the first intermission is over, phase 3 will begin, which lasts until the boss reaches 25%. You'll notice that critically, the entire range group stacks up kind of between the entrance and the boss off to the left side here. And the reason for this is that instead of now going in a half circle to dodge mines and such with the boss in the middle of the room, for this phase we actually transition in sort of a straight line from left to right and then right to left and back and forth. And the reason for that is because of the Mark of Chaos Fortification. So the modification to the Mark of Chaos ability on the tanks in this phase essentially causes that tank to be rooted in place, and they cannot move until they explode within the 35-yard radius, and obviously anyone close will get destroyed. So the way that we found worked best for this is, instead of trying to rig it up so that the tank is just far away when it happens and then we pull the boss back, we did it the other way. So we moved from left side, Mark of Chaos hits the tank that's over there, and then the entire raid group just moves to the right side. So you can see we go from purple on the left to green on the right for the melee and tanks, and similarly we're going left to right and right to left with the range group. And sometimes you can't really see the view, obviously, because I'm handling branded and stuff here, but like I said, that's the basic idea. So here the second Mark of Chaos went off. There's our tank and the green marker getting really big and exploding. And now exploded, but everyone's safe because we went to the other side. So that's the basic process for this Fortification phase 3. And everything sort of revolves around that. Meanwhile, you can still handle the branded in the same basic manner, so people can still run backwards when they initially get targeted by it, and then meet up with the branded buddies and all that good stuff. So while the management of branded fortification is the same, the critical aspect is that the jump distance in the fortified version is only reduced by 25% per jump instead of 50%. So there you can see the new modified table that shows the jump distance at any given stack, and you can see that it takes far more jumps in total for the distance to be reduced down to the same levels that it was at even 4 or 5 stacks of all the other versions of branded. Because of that, Fortification is the version that will probably do the most damage to the individuals that are handling it, so you may need to prepare for cooldowns on those jumps, because you can see the base damage starts to climb up pretty high, and you have to go to a reasonable number of stacks to be able to get out of range. So typically what we found worked was 5 or 6 stacks was enough, at least for me as a monk, to get out of range, because during this phase in particular, the range group is already not really that close, and I can also go sort of kitty corner to their location. So here I'm at 6 stacks, which means the jump distance is only 47 yards, which is just barely out of my heal range, so it's not that significant of a distance. So that's pretty much the Fortification branded management. Like I said, the mechanics are the same, it's just you have to do more stacks of it. The last thing to mention here is the force wave, which is extremely deadly on this particular phase. It's a set of 3 waves back to back when it casts. So you can see the purple waves there going out. And this is just a lot of damage on the raid. So this is, like I said in the previous intermission section, this is probably where you'd want raid cooldowns in particular, because that damage just can be very spiky, particularly when you're combining it with other damage sources, such as the arcane pulses from the ad, or the hits from the branded people, that are transferring that back and forth. So don't be afraid to rotate raid cooldowns for those. So once the boss hits 25%, you will enter the second intermission, and you're on the home stretch at this point. This is identical to the first intermission with one new addition, and that is the Reaver Ogre, which will spawn and run in from the entrance. You see him there in the back. So this Reaver is the reason that we use the Death Grip on the leftmost mage when it spawns by the red marker there. Because the mages have that aura that I mentioned before, within about 25 yards, that buffs any other enemies near them, by pulling the mage away from the door and killing them toward the center, we can then have a gap between the entrance where the Reaver spawns and the left side of the room, which is the side that the boss is powering up as a rune on and whatnot, and where the other tank is. So you may have noticed what we did is we'll loop it back here, but the tank that's picking up the Reaver kind of moves him off to the left as soon as he comes out, and he's tauntable and stuff, and avoids the Reaver being buffed by the mages for any period of time that matters, I guess. And then the Reaver can be moved toward the other tank position where the anomalies are and whatnot. So the reason for moving the Reaver off to the left side and toward the other tank position is twofold. One, the Reaver needs to be faced away from other players because it does a shockwave attack. But more importantly, it will frequently use the Kick to the Face ability. And this is a knockback and also a threat drop ability. So, by having both tanks get threat on it, obviously if it drops threat on the current tank, it can just go to the other tank for a short period until the first tank can taunt off. Now you can technically taunt immediately after Kick to the Face occurs, as long as you're not knocked out of range of it, of the mob, with your back to a wall or something like that. But we found that allowing both tanks to get threat was much safer. It also allows both tanks to do some damage to the aberrations, as well as the Reaver itself, so it dies a little bit faster and all that good stuff. So really there was no downside and a lot of upside to doing it this way. So other than that, the basic method here is the same as before. You want to kill the mages first, as they're the most dangerous, then the Reaver if it's still alive, and then finally whittle down the anomalies slowly, so again they don't area of effect and just destroy your raid all at once. And again, you can have anomalies into the last phase for a little bit without too much worry. So that's pretty much it. Really practicing the first intermission doesn't really make the second intermission that much more difficult. You just have to make sure your tank is ready to pick up that Reaver when it comes out and get it positioned, and then both tanks are getting threat on it for those kicks to the face. So finally, after the second intermission, you're in phase 4 and you're about to finish him up. I should mention that we needed the extra DPS on the intermission phase, second phase, so we used Bloodlust during that. But if you can afford to save your damage cooldowns, you can use Bloodlust and whatnot on this phase and really push through quite quickly. So as I mentioned, this is all about replication. So the mines, for example, they will duplicate themselves when they naturally are supposed to expire. So you'll get 2 and then 4 and then 6, or excuse me, and then 8 and so on. The Arcane Aberration spawn, when it's killed, it will spawn a bunch of little aberrations. So you should probably just focus and kill those aberrations off. We didn't really do so here, but they do a significant amount of damage, so it's tough to say whether it's worth it or not. You could also just cleave them down over time. The Force of Nova is probably the most dangerous ability in this phase, And it's the reason that our positioning strategy completely changes for this last phase. You'll notice that while the range was all stacked up beforehand, here you can see we're all spread out quite nicely around the room in a circle. And this is because of that force. So the replication version causes every player that's afflicted by the actual Force Nova pulses, so you can watch closely, to shoot out in a small radius around them, pulsing arcane damage. So this is critical that your raid members are spread out when this occurs. I would highly recommend even having your melee run out slightly to spread just as it's about to occur. You do see the cast bar for the boss, so you do have a little bit of time to react if your boss timers are not accurate, which they probably won't be. So highly recommend moving the boss to the center once you kind of get established into the phase and spreading around primarily for the Force Nova. The other reason for spreading is for branded replication. So the way this one works is when it casts initially, it still goes on one person, but then the first time it splits, or excuse me, the first time it jumps, it splits into two. So you'll have it on two players pretty much always when it's active, I should say. So rather than trying to do two teams of buddies like we're normally going to do, because the jump distance is reduced down to 50% of the previous each time, just like the normal version, we found it was better to just spread out, let it jump naturally to whoever it's going to be on, and then those people can then run out when it reaches a reasonable stack. For us, it was about 5. So there are some tweaks that we could make, which we didn't do in this particular kill. For example, if it's on a melee, I would still recommend those players run out and put it onto a ranged, because in the ranged, once they reach 5 stacks, can safely run backwards away from everybody and get rid of it. Whereas melee can't really do that fast enough. So that'd be one tweak that I would make, but otherwise this method worked quite well. Rather than trying to manage 2 pairs of players when you don't really need to do so, because pretty much anyone in the raid can take 5 stacks of damage. It's not a problem. And then finally, the Mark of Chaos for tanks, replication. Just like the standard version, it will just apply to the tank where they're standing, and they'll run away 35 yards out. But in this case, they will shoot orbs of chaos out in just 8 directions all around them. And these orbs obviously do a lot of damage, so you don't want to get hit. But because the tank can freely run whichever direction they need to go, it's actually quite easy to avoid. You just have to communicate when it's about to explode, and then players can watch from that angle to see if the orbs are coming near them or not. So overall, I think, like I said, the main thing in this phase is just handling the Force Nova properly, staying spread for that. You don't be afraid to use survival cooldowns for it, since this is the end of everything. I would also kill off the ads, particularly if there's a lot of damage on the raid. You can extend this phase quite a while. It will take a long time before the mines actually overwhelm you. The boss will easily be dead by then. So I think if you focus on handling the ads and mitigating the Force Nova damage, you can prolong it long enough to get the boss down. So I know it's a lot of crap, but it's really just one phase at a time, like all these sort of long end zone fights. Just learn the first phase and the core mechanics initially, and then you can move on to the next phase, and the next phase, intermission, and so on. So that is the heroic and normal raid guide for Imperator Margok. As always, I hope you enjoyed. Please subscribe, and we will see you soon for Mythic. Exciting. Thanks, guys. See you next time.